Well, I'm not going to move away from tragedy because we're in the book of Judges, and I want to be talking about Gideon, and I'm going to focus in on Gideon tonight. Now, maybe you know the story of Gideon well, maybe you don't. Maybe you only know part of it, because with Gideon, unfortunately, we often don't tell his whole story. Because it's a great encouraging story at the start about God raising a man up, trusting God despite initial doubts, and having a massive victory. However, the end of Gideon's story shows that even the greatest victories can be undone by a life not lived right before God, which is a very important lesson. So there's a lot to cover. So I'm going to give broad strokes to Gideon's story because it's a long story. To read his story more fully, read Judges 6 to 8. Often we stop at chapter 7 because they're the encouraging ones, but then there's chapter 8, and it's actually worth reading chapter 9 to see the fallout from his life as well. So, very quickly, in the cycle of rebellion and oppression at this time, it's Midian who are the oppressors of Israel at this point. The Amalekites are doing it as well. And every time Israel plants its crops, they come and destroy them, leaving them impoverished, hungry, poor and stuck. So Israel once again cried out to God. And God then comes to Gideon. It says he's visited by the angel of the Lord. And now remember, we've talked about this before. That's very different to an angel of the Lord. This is probably a description of Jesus before he became incarnate. But that's a whole other topic. So he calls Gideon, and he comes to Gideon. And he says, Gideon, you are a mighty man of valour. Valour means bold, determined, heroic. Which kind of seems a bit ironic because Gideon is currently hiding in a wine press, beating out his wheat because he is scared. He is not showing any valour. And the angel says, Gideon, you will be raised up to save Israel. And Gideon says, you must be joking, essentially. He says, my clan is the weakest in the tribe and I am the least in my father's house. You've found the wrong person. I can't do it. Very important this. We must remember what God sees in you is greater than what you see in you. He is great. He can see beyond who you are now. He can see beyond the circumstances that you're in. And that's exactly how it was for Gideon. God saw his bravery and his valour, even though at that point in his life, Gideon didn't. So Gideon steps out a little bit. He says, and he does a little mission, but he's still unsure. So he asks God for a sign. And he lays down a fleece and says, in the morning, if the fleece is wet, but the ground is dry, then I know God will be with me. And God does that. And then, you can relate to Gideon here, I'm sure. He goes, maybe that was God, maybe it wasn't. So this time he says, okay, this time the other way around. Wet ground, dry fleece. And again, God does it. So at this point, Gideon starts to take the hint. He goes out with an army. 32,000 men. Now that's a big army. And God says, that's a big army. In fact, it's too big. That's too big for me to get the glory. If you win, you'll say you did it. So he sends home the men who were afraid, of which there's 22,000. 22,000 men leave. That leaves 10,000 men behind. Now that's still a fair-sized army. So God whittles that number down bit by bit by bit and leaves Gideon with 300 men. 300 in an army. Now that's the kind of number only Spartans normally go for. Now Gideon trusts God at this point in his life. Gideon trusts him and has stepped out in faith. And this is a real testament to how much Gideon now trusts God. He goes into battle with just 300 men. Tremendous step of faith. But it shows that God is the one who brings the victory, because it's the only way they could win. And that's exactly what happens. They defeat the Midianites with 300 men, some trumpets and some jars. And I'll not go into the detail of that now, but that is worth reading because it is a brilliant victory. And when we're telling Gideon's story, we usually stop there because that's great. What we don't often go into is then Gideon pursues the Midianites. And Gideon starts to get a bit full of himself. He starts having a go at people who won't give him food at a place called Succoth. And then at a place called Penuel, he threatens to pull down a tower. In fact, I think he comes back and he does do that. He's become this different guy. You see, a little bit of victory can turn the meekest of people into egotists. And so the people turn to Gideon and say, Gideon, you're doing so well, so well. Rule over us, be our king. Your sons, your grandsons, they could be our kings too. And Gideon says, no. And quite right, because God didn't want Israel to have a king. But here's the problem. Gideon says no, but then he proceeds to go and act exactly like a king. He asks for gold, lots and lots of gold, and then he makes himself a gold ephod, which was something a priest was supposed to wear. So he starts living like a king and dressing like a priest. Well, he doesn't actually wear it because it's made of gold. It would be far too heavy to wear. But it becomes a symbol of his status in the land. Eventually this gold ephod, it becomes a trap for Gideon and his family because it becomes an object of worship. He has 70 sons. That's right, you heard me correctly. 70. How? Well, you can only do that by having a lot of wives. Or a harem, just like a king. His son Abimelech stakes a claim to rule when Gideon dies. He's expecting a hereditary line, just like a king, because that's exactly how Gideon has been ruling. In fact, for a time, Abimelech is announced to be king, and in order to protect his throne, he kills his 70 brothers, and the whole legacy of Gideon's life is left in tatters. He says one thing, don't make me a king, but his actions tell a very different story. When he dies, Israel gets back into the same cycle of rebellion again. So what can we learn from this? Well, first of all, when God calls you a mighty man of valour or woman of valour, trust that God can see something you can't. He sees beyond your circumstances. He sees beyond your limitations. When God calls you, God knows you're capable of what he's called you to do, or he wouldn't have called you to do it. And that's maybe something we need to remind ourselves of. If you've been called by God to something, you are able to do it when you trust in God, otherwise he would not have called you. There was a mighty warrior in Gideon that Gideon couldn't see, but God could. Trust God when God calls you. But also, when God brings victory, please don't get full of yourself. Don't let the victory go to your head. Don't become one of those people who then always become about themselves and push themselves forward. Don't get yourself into the scenario where only half your story will be told and remembered properly, because the later half is less encouraging. Let me tell you, it is easy to be humble when there's nothing going on. But when victory comes, when revival comes, when opportunity comes, when success comes, when salvations come, that's when we can fall. That's when we can get in danger. That's when we need to stay humble. Keep it all in perspective and make sure that when your story is told, someone's going to tell the whole story. Bless you.